In this chapter, we look at the physical development of the brain and the body of individuals in middle age. And as you already know, as was stated before, there's relatively little information and research that is done for individuals that are in middle age. And the reason why is because the changes are very, very gradual for the most part. So the research that's often of interest to people is when there is some type of trauma or disease that affects them, and this mostly due to primary aging, although secondary aging can also be of interest, but not as common. The processing of the speed with which we face our tasks and our assignments is noticeable in terms of how it's slowed down. We see that this is, for the most part, believed to be due to primary aging, but again, like everything else, it's not just nature alone, but it could be also aggravated by secondary aging. So a natural aging process with a not so pleasant or healthy environment can definitely enhance our decrease in processing speed. And by processing, we mean the thought process and also our ability to respond to things either cognitively or physically as well. As we see that our metabolism slows down, our ability to think, our physical endurance, for the most part, is noticeably slower. Our reproductive system is no longer at the prime where it used to be in the late teens and early 20s. In middle adulthood, we find that we are often dealing with what is known as a climacteric period. Climacteric is basically a time during which our reproductive capacity is lost or declines. Now, lost completely is typically for women in middle adulthood, whereas for men it would be a decline. The male climacteric is as we mentioned before, very gradual. Oftentimes we find that it's just the quantity of the sperm that's viable that seems to decline around the age of 40, but that is a slight decline. It's not something that is enough to make someone infertile. And the testicles also shrink gradually, not noticeable naked eye, typically as seen with observation and with precise measurement. And also the volume of the seminal fluid begins to decline around the age of 60. So again, typically by this point, our sex drive is not as high as it used to be. And like many other body functions, this would not be at the prime. Erectile dysfunction also begins to increase, and this is often due to lower testosterone levels because of the shrinking of the testicles, cardiovascular disease, which is what CVD stands for, alcohol abuse, anxiety, stress, drug abuse, and several other components that are environmental can aggravate this condition. For women, it's not as gradual. Menopause is basically the cessation of the monthly menses and also infertility. We find that the average age of menopause is about 50 years of age, with 40 to 6 being the normal, 40 to 60 being normal. And there are three menopausal phases that women go through: the premenopausal, perimenopausal, and postmenopausal. Each of these stages is characterized by different changes in women's bodies. The premenopausal, we actually find that the estrogen levels alone will begin to fluctuate and decline. Please note that at this point the only hormone that seems to be impacted is estrogen, and this will bring about irregular menstrual periods in many women. And even though there's going to be some irregularity, the bleeding still does occur. We find that also ovulation is not necessarily guaranteed to occur, whereas before there could have been an ovulation every month, and that is the ripening of an egg for fertility and to reproduce. We find that at this point, even though there's still some bleeding, there may not necessarily be ovulation. Perimenopausal, we find that there are more variations in the timing of the menstrual cycles. The hot flashes, which are a common which is a common symptom, is experienced by about 75% of women. And it's interesting that to note that this often disrupts a woman's sleeping pattern, and this sleep deprivation is likely to lead to this irritability that may be seen throughout the day. And some, it's not to deny that the hormonal imbalance can, in and of itself, do that, but we find that there is a significant factor here that shouldn't be overlooked, and that is that any individual, regardless of hormonal fluctuations, if you can't sleep at night, more than likely you are not going to be your best during the day. And postmenopausal, we find that this begins when a woman has had no menstrual periods for a year or more, and now we see that there are two hormones that have already dropped to a consistently low level, and this brings about what we could see, which are the breast becoming less firm, the genitals and uterus shrinking, the vaginal becoming shorter, smaller, and also with less elasticity and transudation. Now, transudation is basically what leads to the lubrication during sexual arousal, and we find that with the vaginal walls going through these changes, it inhibits the transudation that used to be more easily attained in earlier stages of our life. It's interesting to point regarding hot flashes that of those who, per a study in 1987, says that of those who actually have hot flashes, 85% of them will have them for more than a year, and a third or more will have them for 5 years or more. So it's not going to be a fun time, and it can also be a trying time for relationships and those that may surround them. Hot flashes on average will last about 3 minutes and may occur as seldom as daily or as often as 3 times per hour. So if you're a woman, hopefully it's on the lower end of the spectrum. The temperature of the skin can actually rise as much as 1 to 7 degrees in some parts of the body, but the core body temperature actually drops. So it is really an interesting change that the body is going through, and that's what we said we could not deny the importance of the fluctuations of hormones and how your mental state and mood can be. We find that serious depression, as was defined in the DSM-4, the text revision, is a criteria for major depressive disorder, is no more frequent among menopausal women than among those who are menopausal. So important to be understanding of this if we have female partners that may need our support and understanding and patience, and also important to be proactive on learning about this and maybe being able to process it slightly different by regulating emotions and avoiding circumstances that could aggravate them. Osteoporosis is something that women are at greater risk after menopause, and that is the loss of bone mass that results in having bones that are brittle and porous, so they're more likely to crack, to fracture, to break. This begins around the age of 30 for both men and women, but again, because of these changes and the hormonal changes in women, this makes them more susceptible to suffering from that. This is something that can be prevented by taking enough calcium in early adulthood and exercising regularly. And what we mean by early adulthood, we're talking about 20s. For women, it is recommended that there be a regular calcium intake. And so far, there's no research that indicates that there are risks associated with that. But for men, it's not the case. We'll talk about that in a bit. Presbyopia, or presbyopia, as is pronounced in both ways, is basically the loss of our visual acuity with aging. And this is something that has to do with our ability to focus. The eyes are on objects that are nearby. This is the result of the thickening of the lens. The lens is an anatomical part that sits behind the pupil, and it basically is responsible for bending light. It reduces the amount of light that reaches the retina, and the retina is at the back part of the eye. And by bending, it allows us to focus, to adjust how our vision is so that we could make something that is blurry, make it clear. By the age of 45 or 50, we find that almost everybody needs glasses, and one of the common reasons is, again, the thickening of the lens. There are surgical procedures that some people are eligible for, and that is a procedure in which, through a laser, they could shave off, if you will, part of the lens, and it would allow for it to be flexible and bend again, as there are muscles that actually flex, and based on that, they'll bend the lens, which would allow us to see clearly or not. Presbycusis is a normal loss of hearing with aging, and this is especially true for high frequency tones and high pitch tones. We find that as we get older, we lose our ability to hear a high pitch sound more so than the low pitch sound. And by that we mean like the high notes. Somebody with a deep voice is likely to be heard for extended periods of time, long after we go through this, but someone with a very, very high-pitched sound is likely to not be heard as well as, again, someone with a lower pitch. This is because of primary aging and secondary aging, as the inner ear will gradually degenerate as a result of basic wear and tear. But if we expose ourselves to loud environments on a regular basis, like nightclubs, concerts, or work in places where there's a lot of noise and we don't protect our ears, then we could accelerate this in here. The hearing loss is typically slow before the age of 50, and we see that it would accelerate, that rate at which the hearing loss occurs would accelerate after 50 or 55. Cardiovascular disease, basically a set of disease that processes in the heart and circulatory system. And this is the leading cause of death in the United States. We have 27% of the deaths among middle adult that occur each year. And sadly, there is no indication, no symptoms that would occur before. Typically, a sudden heart attack would be the first indication of the problem. And that's when we then start making changes to our diet or different lifestyle living conditions that we have. Strongly associated with lifestyle factors such as, again, smoking, diet, and exercise. But again, we should be taking a proactive approach rather than a remedial approach. Please note that this is not a natural consequence of aging in and of itself, so it is preventable. The type A personality is one that is associated with cardiovascular disease, and that is a personality that, like yours truly, I need to work on. This is a personality type that makes us very competitive. There's often a way of processing life tasks with a sense of urgency that is not healthy, and as a result of that, then there's a lot of pressure. Our body, our system, feels it. The type B personality is a more laid back, less competitive, less hostile, and we find that they have a tendency to live longer. Rarely ever are there people that are purely type A and purely type B. There's often a mix between the two. As we get older, we understand now that we may not be able to multitask as well as we did before. We need to change our diet. We need to make changes to our lifestyle. And we find that the selective optimization with compensation, which is the process of balancing the gains and losses that are associated with aging, help us live more efficiently and perform our tasks. So we often find that as we get older, we select one task to which most of the time and physical resources will be devoted to, and then we switch on to another. Although teenagers claim to have to study better with iPad and iPhone and TV and then their book, That's not true. They don't study better, but they are better than older adults at that. As we get older, and with the reduction in the processing speed of our brain, we notice that we are not capable of doing multiple things at once as well as we may have before. And this is also impacted by our changes in our memory and our cognition. We find that um, our research on this topic is limited mostly to younger and older adult groups, but we do find that forgetfulness does increase with age. Usually it's not noticed until after the age of 55, but you will begin to see that in their kind of become part of who you are. The distractions that you may get sometimes while engaging in a conversation may be more frequent. We find that overall middle-aged adults often pay more attention to themes than like the general theme than small details, and that is believed to be associated with a broad understanding of what took place rather than the specifics of what took place. And we find that in order for us to retain our memory and our cognition as sharp as we possibly can, we need to use it regularly. So it is often encouraged that we engage in intellectually challenging activities. As you may remember, that neurogenesis occurs typically when there's a challenging environment, and this would result, as expected, to inferior losses in cognitive skills. In fact, we find that lack of mental exercise tends to be correlated with declines in memory and cognitive skills. But the major deficits are not found until after the age of 60 and 65. So again, taking a proactive approach earlier in life serves us best.